Speaker 2 is code 4061, answering the question, does the future of Brazil rely upon the end of dictatorial rule?
You can tell a lot about a world leader from their Twitter page, whether it's Iran's Ayatollah and their thinly veiled threats, Donald Trump not having one, or President Jair Bolsonaro, whose tweet from 1 hour ago said, quote, "Top Gun Maverick, thumbs up." And I agree. I mean, combine Extemp nerdy war politics with the likes of Miles Teller? Yes, please. But that's probably the only good take that President Jair Bolsonaro has had in a while, as explained by America's Quarterly, a quarterly source about the Americas, on May 31st, 2022. While he's been President Jair Bolsonaro has slowly eroded the democratic rights of his country, whether it be taking away the freedom of speech, eroding and creating more power within the military, or cutting back on COVID-19 protections. It seems that all hope has been lost for Brazil for a while. But most recently, former president of the country, Lula da Silva, a leftist candidate, announced his run for president in October of this year, when he hopes to salvage the remains of what Bolsonaro has destroyed. So considering that by the time the trophies behind me have been passed out to their recipients at the end of today, 150 Brazilians will have died because of Bolsonaro's COVID-19 policies. But also because a leftist revolution in Brazil could mean a revolution for all of South America. It becomes imperative that we ask today's question: does the future of Brazil rely upon the end of dictatorial rule? The answer is a resounding yes, because Bolsonaro is poisoning the country, and we can see why in three main ways. First, because his COVID-19 response continues to end lives. Second, because his economic policies are pushing the country further towards the edge. And third and finally, because the risk of a military coup is imminent. First, at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, President Jair Bolsonaro said that the COVID-19 vaccine would turn you into a crocodile. But crocodiles are not the only slimy reptiles in Brazil. Giving us the first reason that the future of the country relies upon the end of dictatorial rule, because his COVID-19 response continues to end lives. The New York Times explains in an article written on May 31st, 2022, that as president of Brazil, especially at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, Bolsonaro expanded his executive authority, denying congressional requests to accept COVID-19 aid from other countries, and instead stopped the shipments of vaccines, masks, and medication. Now, as Reuters explains on April 17th, 2022, this expansion of dictatorial power has meant that within the country, it wasn't until January of this year that a COVID-19 vaccine was authorized for children in the country, meaning that the country only has a 60% vaccination rate compared to the World Health Organization's recommendation of between 70 and 80%. This means that primarily, unless Bolsonaro is kicked out of office in October of this year, more people will continue to die, like 71-year-old Antilla in Brazil, who died in a hospital last year because it didn't have enough medication for him, because Bolsonaro stopped those shipments. But if Lula becomes president of this country, more medications, more vaccines, and more aid will be sent. President Bolsonaro recently announced new investments into the cyber infrastructure of Brazil to expand cyber attacks against countries and people, especially those who have been pretty mean to him. So if my mic pack goes off before the end of this speech, we can blame it on him. But the second reason that President Jair Bolsonaro needs to go for the future of Brazil to be stable is because Second, his economic policies are pushing the country closer towards the edge. The South China Morning Post explains in an article written on May 15, 2022, that the government-owned agency, Petrobras, is President Bolsonaro's state-owned oil company. And because of this, because shareholder interests in the government have slowly decreased due to the fuel crisis across the international community, the organization recently increased prices to $20 a gallon. I thought we in Phoenix, Arizona had it bad. But the Wall Street Journal explains on June 2nd, 2022, what this has meant for millions of Brazilians. As inflation and oil prices have increased within the country, 27 million Brazilians have been pushed into poverty, devastating not just their economy, but their livelihoods. So long as Bolsonaro stays president and his dictatorial rule resumes, the interests of the government will be put ahead of the interests of the people. So 31-year-old Franciel, who lives on $1.80 every single day, will continue to starve because she cannot afford food. But finally, while he may think he's the main character, President Bolsonaro is certainly not an original one. He's following Donald Trump's blueprint of decertifying an election before it's even happened. This gives us the third and final way, though, that the future of Brazil depends upon the end of a dictatorial rule, because the threat of a military coup is imminent. As explained by the New York Times in a separate article, this time written on June 15th, 2022, right now in Brazil, President Bolsonaro is expanding not just his dictatorship, but his military control to over 340,000 servicemen and women within the country, calling on them to certify election results in October, saying that if they are not involved, he will protest the election. That means that now, as the Human Rights Watch explains on June 3rd, 2022, not only are 340,000 service members within the country under the control of Jair Bolsonaro, but when he threatens to decertify this election that will be rightfully and democratically held, millions of voices will be ignored. Meaning that as The Atlantic predicts on June 6th, 2022, going forward, not only is it incredibly possible that if Lula wins the election without international support, Bolsonaro will lead a military revolution, but that could very well spell the end of Brazil. The slogan of the Washington Post is that democracy dies in darkness. It is our responsibility as an international community to shine a light so bright on Brazil that democracy cannot die there, which is why we asked the question, does the future of Brazil depend upon the end of dictatorial rule? The answer is a resounding yes, because Bolsonaro is poisoning the country, and we saw why in three main ways. First, because his COVID response continues to end lives. Second, because his economic policies are pushing the country towards the brink. And third and finally, because the risk of a military coup is imminent. So, Bolsonaro may like Top Gun Maverick, but going forward, the only way for the country, and my love for Miles Teller to survive, is for democracy to survive too.
Code 4061 will be cross-examined by Code 4016.
Nice job.
Great speech.
Thank you.
I'll start with your thesis. Given that the very reason former President Lula da Silva was removed from power was because he was installed in a nearly $200 million corruption scandal, why would he be any better than Mr. Bolsonaro?
That's actually not relevant when it comes to answering today's question. The question was whether or not democracy is needed for the country to survive. While there may have been corruption in the former regime of Lula da Silva, numerous policies, such as his COVID-19 policy to ask for international aid from the community, whether it be in the form of vaccines, masks, or medication, means that the problems plaguing Brazil would no longer plague them. They can fight corruption another time because Bolsonaro is corrupt too.
Recently, it was found out that Mr. Bolsonaro's administration had actually taken millions of dollars of COVID aid meant for the people. Once again, if he was removed from power and democracy was restored, how exactly would that change given the corrupt nature of Brazil's government?
Well, again, it would be a new president in charge. If President Lula da Silva comes back, not only has he campaigned on an anti-corruption policy, but Either way, the threat of a military taking over the country wouldn't exist anymore.
Moving on to your second point about oil prices and economic hardship. Given that the entire world is facing these problems, what makes Mr. De Silva so qualified to relieve them in Brazil?
A couple of reasons. First, as I explained in my speech, President Lula da Silva is a leftist candidate, one who has continuously campaigned upon the fact that he is going to redistribute wealth from the richest Brazilians to the poorest Brazilians. So that means that for Franciel, who currently only gets about $2 every single day, she'd have more to live on. Even in times of inflation, 27 million people cannot be living in poverty.
And as my final question, leftist candidates have also been elected in Argentina, Ecuador, and El Salvador, and yet they're still facing the same problems. What specifically about Mr. De Silva's leftism is different?
I explained that again in my speech. Right now, President Bolsonaro is the biggest shareholder in the oil company of Brazil known as Petrobras. Because he's the biggest shareholder, he has the most reason to try and increase oil prices, to make more money. So when Petrobras increases their oil prices to $20 per gallon, that only means devastation for the country of Brazil.
Thank you so much.